Welcome back to my series Debunking the Lunacy. I'm Christine Grace and you can find me on Instagram at Christine Grace Smith. Today will be another episode as part of the Debunking the Lunacy series where we delve into the current most delusional concepts around within the mainstream Western media, and we try and make some sense of the often subjective fallacies in order to distinguish some objective truth. Today I want to look at gender identity and gender performativity, an ideology that seems to be governing the narrative on mainstream media and indoctrinating our children. Are there differences in gender psychology and biology? How do our behaviours manifest differently between the two genders? Is this idea that gender is nothing but a social construct a feasible theory? Woke leftism has now told us that gender is a performative construct. The practice of gender ideology has become similar to the institution of modern day marriage, where one side benefits heavily more than the other. Gender ideology is forced on us through mainstream media, corporations, social media, and even more dangerously in certain places by our legal systems and governments. I first heard of this idea of gender as a performance or a social construct while studying A-level media, where I was introduced to a lady called Judith Butler. If I can even call her a lady without being cancelled, I'm sorry. I don't know what gender she's currently performing as. Judith states, there is no primary gender a drag imitates, but gender is kind of an imitation for which there is no original. Butler believes that feminists should try not to define the word woman, totally not degrading to all women who have existed literally ever. These statements are not only purely delusional, but quite frankly, it's laughable. So much so that I typically wouldn't even feel a need to explain why this is entirely illogical. However, in the current cultural climate, I want to break this down to try and discern some logic, to try understand what seems to be a large majority of the internet's belief, at least in the space of TikTok. So let's give the side a chance and let's see if we can make some sense of it. To say that there are certain behaviours that are typically more masculine or more feminine makes sense to me. Stereotypes aren't just made up out of thin air. If I meet a girl who dresses like a tomboy, drinks beers, is into cars and sports, and perhaps works in the construction industry, maybe they're more aggressive, I'm going to think, that's quite a masculine woman. Still a woman nonetheless. In the same way, if I meet a man who likes to wear makeup or gets his nails painted, maybe he's really into the Kardashians or Vogue magazines, and perhaps he works as a nanny. He's more nurturing than most men typically would be. I'm going to think, he's quite a feminine man, but still a man nonetheless. Following Butler's logic, if gender is a performance derived from our acts of behaviour, then this part of the statement reigns true. As we just established, you can have women who behave typically masculine and vice versa. This doesn't feel controversial in my head, but apparently when you say it online it is. However, it's the second half of Judith's statement that just hurts my brain. Gender is a kind of imitation for which there is no original. It's paradoxical. How can you imitate something if there is nothing that you're imitating in the first place? Make it make sense. Butler even says sex itself, the fact of being biologically male or female, is to some degree a performative social construct. We live in a world where words are losing all meaning. This is that whole ideology we keep seeing where there's no such thing as biological sex, no male, no female. And biology is now irrelevant, and having biological men advertising female sanitary products is apparently not offensive to biological women. Here's the flaw in this logic. How can you perform like something, behave like a representation of a gender, if there's no first template of a gender to set the tone for the performance that you are imitating? To say there is no difference between masculine and feminine behaviours is not only delusional, but completely wrong at its core. Gender is not a social construct. It was not created or pushed on us by the patriarchal society. We adapted our behaviours separately as male and female animals since the dawn of time, which has led us to survive as a species to where we are today. Nigel Barber, PhD, released an article in 2019 discussing exactly this. He said, in an era of increasing fluidity, it is worth asking whether gender differences in psychology had been overstated in the past. His findings show that gender differences are more than simply a performance. Unbelievable, right? Who'd have thought?
Who would have thought? Not me.
Barber provides that among mammals, males are generally larger and more aggressive than females. This pattern is related to greater production of testosterone that's also related to increased aggression. Barber continues to highlight the differences in psychology and behaviour further. He tells us that men are actually responsible for about 9/10 of serious crimes of violence, although women are more verbally aggressive and more willing to pick a fight. Men exert physically aggressive behaviour more than women. Among mammals as a group, females are more strongly inclined to care for the young than males. He does, however, acknowledge that there are some exceptions, of course, there always is, such as lion tamarins where males do most of the care for the young. And there are situations where many men are now the primary caregivers for children, but interestingly, it was found that new fathers actually experience a decline in testosterone levels as they adjust to a new nurturing way of life. This alone is a testament to the natural differences in gender development between men and women. It's sad that I even have to highlight this, but even when we look at biological men who have fully transitioned to identify as a woman, despite hormone therapy to reduce testosterone levels, their male physiology is still dominant. It's clear that Leah Thomas, despite her gender identity or performativity, her size, strength, morphology, and physiology is still visibly greater than her competitors, giving her unfair superiority. Another study published by Professor Alison Heather for the National Library of Medicine in 2022 looked at trans women elite athletes and their extra percentage relative to female physiology. She stated, ultimately, the former male physiology of a trans woman provides them with a physiological advantage over biological women. This study further provides that the current IOC regulations allow trans women athletes to compete if testosterone levels have been lowered for at least 12 months prior to the competition. Whilst this does address the advantageous effects of circulating testosterone on athletic performance, it does not take into account the advantage afforded by testosterone exposure prior to transitioning. The research establishes that even with lowering testosterone levels for 12 months, which does decrease the trans women muscle mass, it does not decrease it to the levels of a biological woman. Despite the decrease in muscle mass, muscle strength is still maintained. Again, published to the British Journal of Sports Medicine, research conducted upon the effect of gender-affirming hormones on athletic performance in trans women, finding that, again, after the 12-month suppression period of testosterone that is recommended by World Athletics for inclusion in women's sports, trans women still had a 9% faster mean run speed than females. I think the evidence provided corroborates that our biological factual gender is a bit more than an imitation or a social construct. And there's loads more studies to be found on this. It seems logical to agree that the reason we have stereotypically masculine or feminine traits is because they are founded in our biological heritage, our hormone production, our DNA construction, which exists in all of us and has kept our species alive and prepotent for hundreds of thousands of years. To say gender is a social construct is outrageous, when it's clearly written into our DNA and reflected in our physiology. To say that behaviours exerted by the two sexes is simply a performance founded in no substance is disgustingly offensive to all of humanity that has lived before us, and biology is a science itself. I think we owe our ancestors a degree of graciousness to at least recognise that truth. Perform as you will, but do not say that gender differences have no fundamental meaning or they simply do not exist, when they absolutely do. I saw an article back in April, teachers warn new gender guidance for English schools could put children at risk. In the UK, The Guardian has been a source for news for many since its inception in 1821. It built a reputation for being one of the more notorious newspapers when compared with its competitor tabloids. The paper was once called Britain's non-conformist conscience. Well, that's clearly no longer the case. The Guardian is now tainted by political correctness and has conformed as such. The article begins with a glimmer of hope, stating if a young person seeks to change their name or starts wearing a different uniform, teachers would be instructed not to use the new name or pronoun at the pupil's request until they had obtained parental consent. But upon further reading, The Guardian aims to tear this glimmer of hope down by completely blowing the whole thing out of proportion, claiming a former head of a sixth form college accused the government of creating an atmosphere of fear in which young people no longer felt they could turn to teachers for support. Essentially, they think children should be able to start identifying with something they're not at an already confusing time in their life without having to consult the parents. They seem to want to create a divide between kids and their parents where children talk to teachers first rather than their family. Again, the deputy head of sixth form at a secondary school described the government's plans to include parents as dangerous. He said, "We've had threats of violence towards students from parents." And the entirety of this article is all of these testimonies displaying the narrative that parents should have no say and kids should be free to make up their own minds before their minds and bodies have even fully developed as to not be subjected to violence. But irreversible chemical castration isn't violent at all, is it? An excellent example of yet another article illustrating the narrative to destroy the family unit. Hooray for Western society. I'd like to see some evidence of these cases of serious violence. Shockingly enough, there is none provided in this article. It's all just hearsay. I've seen some of these kids on TikTok claiming that their parents are them for not calling them by their chosen name or pronoun. They're absolutely screeching at the parents who are calmly trying to tell them the truth of their physiology. I think we've all just been left with a bit too much time on our hands, and this whole thing has just completely gotten out of control, especially when you're dealing with already confused and hormonal teenagers. But hey, what do I know? I've heard the same argument time and time again. Children can't get reassignment surgery or hormone therapy. Children can't get gender reassignment surgery. Children can't get hormone therapy. A pathetic excuse from the woke left to try and hide the insidious permissions that they pass in the name of gender affirmation. A seriously scary case that I want to show you guys is Bell v Tavistock. The precedent this case establishes within British law is alarming to say the least. Bell v Tavistock was a case before the Court of Appeal on the question of whether puberty blockers should be prescribed to under 16s with gender dysphoria. The Court of Appeal held that it was for clinicians rather than the court to decide on competence in order to consent to receive puberty blockers. The British courts have said that under the age of 18, you're not deemed competent enough to vote, you cannot have an active participation yet in democracy, you do not get a say in the politicians and lawmakers within your society, and, well, rightly so, most people before the age of 18 don't have enough life experience or maturity to comprehend such concepts. However, in the UK, before the age of 18, you can receive irreversible, life-changing treatment that holds extreme physical and mental risks at the discretion of a clinician, with no law in place to uphold third-party integrity or to avoid exploitation from corrupt clinicians. My question is, why is this the case? It seems blatantly obvious to me why we've seen a surge in teenagers identifying as gender fluid since 2019, a surge that is exponentially growing year on year. A glimmer of hope is that there has been a pause on this case. An independent cast review is being held to decide whether the decision of this case will be upheld or whether gender therapy and gender reassignment surgery will only be used in clinical practice. I really hope it's the latter. But I think all it's going to take is a few transgender people to protest outside the Houses of Parliament, and unfortunately, given that our government has absolutely no backbone, I think it will be upheld, unfortunately, but I'm trying to remain optimistic, so we'll see what happens. We should hopefully find out later this year or next year. Not only is this gender ideology attacking children and the family unit, but women specifically are being neglected. The woke left now insists women are nothing but breeders or birthing people. It's so horrifically dehumanizing and downright disrespectful. A lot of the same people pushing feminism and equality are also pushing for women to lose all fairness in sports by allowing and praising biological men taking women's titles. The same woke left that preaches female empowerment praises men to not only be the face of women's products, including men with penises being allowed to advertise women's menstrual products, and pushing women so far away from having any voice anymore that now men who have identified as a girl for less than a year can not only meet the president, but can also apparently qualify to speak on the beauty of girlhood, rather than someone who was born a girl who actually understands what it means to be a woman, who's not playing a character, who has actually grown up and developed naturally as a woman. It's disgustingly offensive. Being a woman is not a costume. You hear all this talk from the woke left of the patriarchy and men having all the power, yet they're giving up spaces predominantly belonging to women that real women have worked hard for just to give it back to a man. Men in dresses who stuck on a bit of makeup. Please make it make sense. I think we all know who I'm talking about. A current demonstration of the indoctrination that gender ideology can be constituted as nothing but a performance, or an imitation, or an act, is the travesty Dylan Mulvaney, the phony persona that makes a mockery of real women. Dylan first broke the internet when he released his first episode of his so-called transition, titled Day One of Being a Girl. When I first saw this video, it seemed to me like it was a man making a satirical video. Stereotypes are funny. We see them in comedy and satire all the time. I thought this was a man making comedy, not a trans woman genuinely believing that wearing dresses and crying hysterically and ordering the wrong thing is what it meant to be a woman. Unbeknownst to me at the time, there was a sinister ideology lurking in the essence of Dylan's message, blurring the lines of reality, reducing women and their lives to nothing but crying, ordering dresses, wearing lipstick, and erratic hysterical behaviour. From what I've seen of Dylan since his latest character's inception is dangerously narcissistic and especially damaging to children. Dylan has gained an unbelievable amount of attention and is praised in the public eye for his bravery, and again, pushing real women out of the limelight whilst he takes centre stage. Apparently, a man who decides one day he is a girl is brave, and women who are born female, who have gone through female puberty and evolved into beautiful women who can hopefully create life, they're supposed to just sit back and applaud as they pass over their position to a biological man. I do not find this brave in any way, shape, or form. In fact, I find it extremely derogatory and misogynistic. There is a hatred for biological women lurking behind this agenda to remove the word woman from our vocabulary and everything it means to be one. This portrayal is not that of a woman, but rather a twisted infantile fantasy, and the compliance of the world around Dylan to not address the issue at hand is teaching our children that you can be a woman if you simply behave as Dylan does. It's reductionist, and it's insulting to biological women. Dylan is a performer, and as he performs, he still claims that this character is his authentic self. It's entirely contradictory. Dylan claims he can be a mum one day, which is biologically impossible. Not only is it confusing to children, it's taking away from biological women again. The beauty of the creation of life is being stripped from us by a biological man. But I'm yet to hear any feminists complain. They just blindly follow whatever narrative is put in front of them and allow narcissists to fool them into thinking this is somehow fairness, equality, and inclusion. I wish it was as simple for the woke left to just perform as they wish without trying to push their whole ideology that's founded in delusion on the rest of society. Gender performativity and fluidity ideology is authoritarian in its essence, where there is a lack of concern for the wishes or opinions of others who simply do not wish to conform to this ideology. It heavily benefits the people who buy into it at the expense of the people who don't. Real female athletes are being punished for their hard work when a biological man decides to come into a sport and is clearly an unfair advantage, and applauded by the audience out of the fear of being deemed politically incorrect. Children are deprived of their innocence and exposed to explicit sexualization, where parents are taking them to drag shows in the name of inclusivity and political correctness. Parents are being arrested for opposing that their beloved children undergo gender reassignment surgery before the age of 18. Children so young that they can't vote or consent to sex yet, but they can legally go through irreversible castration. Teachers are losing their jobs for not using gender-inclusive language. Professors and doctors are losing their jobs and their voices for wanting to stay true to reality, so to not be tainted by the authoritarianism of gender ideology. And YouTubers are being demonetized for speaking out against this tyrannical agenda. They are controlling our right to think and speak freely in truth. Fear has governed our lives so heavily over the last 3 years, and it's spreading all over our society. Suddenly the government can comment on how we live. We're told what we can and can't say, and the mainstream media tells us what are acceptable beliefs and what are not. So much for the Human Rights Act, so much for Articles 9 and 10. The greatest minds and influences our society has to offer are being censored for refusing to give in to this tyrannical woke culture. One of my greatest influences, and I'm sure the influence of many, is Dr. Jordan B. Peterson, a clinical psychologist and professor, a phenomenal intellectual thinker and speaker at that. I actually took myself to one of his lectures for my 22nd birthday, and it was absolutely amazing to say the least. If you're not already aware, Dr. Peterson first went viral for refusing to have his tongue governed by anyone other than himself. A video of him went viral on the internet for criticising political correctness and Bill C. In Canada, the law will penalise citizens who do not use specific pronouns when referring to gender diverse people. There is now legal precedent to govern what you can and cannot call someone should they identify as gender diverse, even if they are clearly a biological man or woman. So even if you make a mistake, you could be subjected to criminal action. I have no problem with what you identify as. Identify as you will, but I shall not be governed to reinforce your subjective identity in any way that equates to objective, factual reality. This was Peterson's worry, and rightly so. Laws that prohibit any way of speaking or thinking are fundamentally tyrannical in their nature. This is seriously scary to me as to the current state of our culture. Everything we've seen over the last few years, I see our governments having too much power and influence over the freedom of how we conduct our lives. I graduated university with a Bachelor of Laws degree, which is the precursor to becoming a qualified lawyer in the UK. As part of this degree, I studied human rights in quite some depth. One thing that's really interesting about the legal system here in the United Kingdom is that we have common law. Common law is not written statute legislation, but rather it's constructed by cases where deciding principles within the courts establish a legal precedent. Typically, when common law varies with UK statute, the statute will overrule. However, from my analysis, this hasn't always been the case with regard to human rights, at least not within the last 3 years. I've seen the Human Rights Act get twisted and bent in certain places with certain situations that have happened. My point is, once you have laws that seek to control what you can and can't say, we're headed down a very slippery slope. Because once you have one case where a precedent is established for what can and can't be said, it gives the government and the courts the authority to create more laws, perhaps expanding outside of gender pronouns, that can govern what you can and can't say, or even believe. Should this be the case, we would no longer have freedom of speech. Luckily for us in the United Kingdom, our criminal court system is based upon a burden of proof, so actually being arrested and imprisoned for saying the wrong thing probably, hopefully, wouldn't happen, unless there was overwhelming evidence that it was carried out with violence as to constitute a hate crime. Of course, that is based upon the hope that the word violence is being used in its correct definition. It's increasingly feeling as though there's no variety to opinions anymore. Opinions that do not conform to the current agenda are no longer accepted and are ultimately bigoted. Protection of our human rights within Western society, so to not be subjected to authoritarian ideologies and tyranny, is a significantly paramount endeavour to me. I could easily go into this for another good few hours, but we shall delve into it in another episode. Be sure to come back and tune in for that one. If you liked the video, please hit the like button, comment and share. Let me know in the comments your stance on gender ideology, and of course, let me know where I can improve my content. And if you have any topics that you want me to cover next, make sure you leave your ideas in the comments below. Let's keep our voices our own. Don't allow the woke left to take reality from us, and don't let governments and corporations dictate our freedom of speech. And as always, let's try to remain harmonious in the adversity of opinion. It's only through disagreements and debates that we can learn about the world around us in its authentic form. Sending love to you all. See you next time.